Today we're going to be discussing a new report that we just released. It's called A Survey of State-Level Cost and Benefits Estimates of Renewable Portfolio Standards. This is Lori Bird. I'm with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, and my colleague Galen Barbos is also on the line, and we'll be presenting the results of this study. I'd like to thank the Department of Energy for supporting this work. The study was primarily funded by the Department of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy Strategic Programs Office. It was also supported in part by the Solar Energy Program and the Office of Electricity. So thank you very much to the DOE for supporting this work. I'd also like to mention that the report is available on the web, on both the NREL website and the LBNL websites, and those links are available in the presentation here. So today I'm going to go through, Galen and I are going to give an overview of the report. I'm going to start with some highlights of the report. I'm going to talk about methods for determining the cost impacts, and then Galen's going to talk about RPS compliance costs, and then we'll talk about the benefits estimates and some conclusions. So with respect to the highlights, this report was a survey of existing state-level RPS cost and benefits estimates. We looked at calculation methods, and the estimates rely upon existing data, typically reported by electric utilities, data from the Commission. So I just want to emphasize that we do use available data in this report. And I'd also like to note that because the reported values might differ from those that could be derived from a more consistent analytical treatment, we don't provide any aggregate national estimates of RPS costs or benefits. So we're presenting really an overview of state-level costs. So a key finding over we looked at a 3-year period for the data of 2010 through 2012 because we wanted to capture any variation in costs over that period. But we found over that period, on average, the estimated incremental RPS compliance costs were about 1% of retail electricity rates. And it's important to note, I think, that future compliance costs are limited in most cases, in most states, by the presence of cost containment mechanisms, and those can vary depending on the state. The structure of those vary, but many states do have limitations on the amount that of the compliance costs. We also looked at benefits estimates that were developed, and we specifically focused on estimates of benefits that were developed for RPS programs. We did not look at broader literature on renewable energy benefits and things like that, but we were pretty focused on studies that were done for RPS specifically. We found that there are a limited number of studies that we identified. The states that have estimated those benefits have typically done so for avoided emissions, economic development, and or wholesale electricity price suppression effects. And those, the avoided emissions numbers are about $4 to $23 per megawatt hour of renewable generation. The economic development numbers range from $22 to $30 per megawatt hour, and the wholesale electricity price suppression benefits were $2 to $50 per megawatt hour of renewable generation. I'll note that that last number is not the actual, the change in the wholesale electricity price was lower, more on the order of $1 per megawatt hour or less, but this number here reflects the benefit reflected as the total generation of renewables. And I'll just note, too, that we did find there were differences in cost methodologies and assumptions that were used across the utility data and across states. And because of those differences, some states are beginning to look into developing standardized methods of developing cost estimates. Okay, with that, I'm going to jump down to cost methodologies, and we're going to talk about that more specifically. I just wanted to give a few highlights of the study first. So, first off, the costs that we examine here, we looked at incremental costs, so the cost of the renewables above and beyond what would have otherwise occurred. So, above and beyond the avoided costs of conventional generation. Some states have tried to estimate gross costs of the RPS, and we note some of that in the report, but we did, the estimates that we present here are really incremental. And so states have used different approaches to try to determine these incremental costs, and particularly there's significant variation in the states that are traditionally regulated. And the different methods that they have used are looking at a proxy generator, the type of generator that might operate if the renewables were not operating. Some have used a market price approach, the cost to purchase wholesale power, and others have done modeling with and without the renewable generation to try to estimate these avoided costs. And in restructured markets, we estimated the incremental compliance cost basically based on the cost of the REC price and the cost of the utility or entity, compliance entity, in complying with the regulation, so the amount of generation required. So next slide, this map provides some perspective on the differences in methods that have been used across states. So you can see in the red, the dark red color, those are the states that are restructured and where a REC price method has been utilized. In some of the other states, we see proxy generators or modeling approaches and things. And a couple states where the hatching is shown have used either hybrid approaches or different approaches, a couple different approaches to estimating costs. So what are some of the factors that influence cost calculations? One of the key issues, there's significant discussion in the report on this, but some of the key issues that can influence what the cost numbers are the treatment of renewable generation that was installed prior to the launch of the RPS, the treatment of indirect costs like administrative costs, the time frame over which the costs are estimated, the inclusion of a carbon adder for determining the avoided costs of the conventional generation. And I guess I also want to note that in the restructured markets, the REC price methodology has been used here, but it's important to note that REC prices do not necessarily reflect the incremental cost of renewable generation because they're heavily influenced by supply and demand balance in the region. So I think that's an important consideration. So now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Galen Barbos of the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, and he's going to go through some of the historical cost data. So Galen, do you want to take it away? Galen, are you there?
Sure. Thanks, Lori. I'm there. Can you hear me now? Yep, sorry, I had myself muted. All right, well, thanks, Lori. So I'm going to run through some historical data on RPS compliance costs, looking specifically at the 2010 to 2012 period. First, though, I want to just give a brief preamble and reiterate some of what Lori laid out. Yeah, so Carolyn, you can, yep, there you go, perfect. First and foremost, I do just want to sort of be clear that we're focusing here on the incremental cost, as Lori said. So in other words, the cost to the utility net of the avoided cost of the non-renewable generation that's being displaced by the renewables. And as Lori also explained, the approach and the data sources we're using here differ between, on the one hand, restructured states where we rely on REC pricing data, and on the other hand, the regulated states where we're largely just sort of synthesizing the estimates that utilities and PUCs have developed themselves, often within the context of annual RPS compliance filings or reports to state legislatures. So for both sets of states, we present these incremental cost estimates in terms of two different metrics which have slightly different intuitions. The first is the incremental dollar per megawatt hour cost of the renewable energy procured. So this is basically the above market cost of each megawatt hour of renewable energy that was purchased, or each REC that was purchased. And then the second metric is the sum total incremental cost of all RPS purchases as a percentage of average retail rates. And so you can think about this essentially as representing the rate impact of the RPS under a certain set of idealized conditions where the utility costs are fully and immediately passed through to customers, which is not always actually the case in reality. So there are lots and lots of caveats and limitations to the data and to the numbers I'll be presenting. We lay those out in some of the following slides and of course in further detail within the report itself. I want to highlight just one kind of critical and overarching point now, and that's that the data I'm about to present represent net costs to the utility. This is not a societal cost-benefit analysis. After I've presented these data, Lori's going to then present some additional information on broader societal benefits that have been estimated for a number of states. But for a variety of reasons, for the time being, I'm going to focus just solely on the net costs from the utility perspective. So with that, we can move on to the next slide here. So I'm going to start out focusing just on the restructured states, and then I'll separately present the data for the regulated states. For the restructured states, again, we're relying on REC prices as the basis for calculating the net compliance costs. And these REC pricing data come from a whole variety of different sources. Where possible, though, we do try to rely on data that has been collected and reported by the PUC and that reflects actual average prices for RECs retired in each year. There are a number of caveats relating specifically to the data and methods used for these restructured states. I'll just mention the first one here, and that's that REC prices, as many of you no doubt know, tend to be quite volatile, and in the short run are partly a function of just whether a particular state was over or under supplied relative to its RPS obligation. And so this is a dynamic that we'll see on the next couple slides, but I thought it was just important to indicate at the outset that these prices don't always correspond well to underlying trends in the levelized cost of electricity from renewable generators. So next slide. Moving into the data here, we present incremental costs in terms of dollars per megawatt hour of RECs procured among the restructured states. And you can think about the data on this slide as basically being the weighted average price of all RECs and alternative compliance payments used to meet the target in each year. And so looking across these states and years, you can see quite a bit of variability, ranging from close to zero in a couple states to upwards of $60 per megawatt hour in one case. And those trends, that variability is partly a function of the underlying REC pricing trends. And so this is why, for example, we tend to see the per megawatt hour costs rising over time among the New England states, as that was a period where supplies were beginning to tighten and REC prices were rising, at least within the main Class 1 tier. And then at the other end of the spectrum are states like Texas, which have large oversupplies of renewables relative to their RPS obligations and therefore persistently low REC prices. The cost trends on this slide are also partly a function of the mix of resources and resource tiers within each state's RPS. And so, for example, you have states like Maine that have large secondary RPS resource tiers that allow large hydro to qualify, which has relatively low RPS costs. And then you've got sort of states on the other end of the spectrum that have solar set-aside requirements that make up a large portion of their overall RPS, and those states tend to have somewhat higher RPS costs, at least according to the metric here. So moving on to the next slide, we flip over to the other cost metric where we show incremental compliance costs as a percentage of retail rates. And so again, these numbers are something like a theoretical rate impact. If you were to imagine the cost that utility bears to be sort of fully and immediately passed through to customers. And here we see that compliance costs in most of these states and years were less than 2% of average retail rates. Again, though, of course, lots of variation. in large measure reflecting the same kinds of issues I mentioned on the previous slide. The only other really important dynamic at play is that some of the variation that we see here is, of course, a reflection of differences in the stringency of the RPS targets. And so that's why, for example, in most of the states here, you can see costs rising from one year to the next as the targets rose. Next slide. So we can disaggregate the cost data for these restructured states on a number of different dimensions. In the top figure, we break the data out according to resource tier. And so you can see here, as you might expect, that the main tier requirements, which some states might be termed Class 1 or Tier 1, that portion of the RPS in most states constituted the bulk of the overall compliance costs, though there are a few interesting exceptions where either the secondary tier or the solar set-aside requirements made up a large portion of the overall cost. In the bottom figure, we break the data out into the costs associated with REC purchases versus the costs associated with alternative compliance payments or penalties. And over this particular 3-year period, most of the states were able to meet their RPS targets without really relying heavily on ACPs, and so as a result, the bulk of the compliance costs in most of these states was in fact associated with REC purchases, though again you can see a few exceptions there. Next slide, we're going to transition now to the regulated states. And as I mentioned, for these states, our approach consisted of really synthesizing RPS compliance cost estimates that have been developed and published by utilities and state PUCs. And we've taken those numbers and translated them into this common set of metrics. And again, I guess I want to be transparent about some of the limits to our analysis. We laid out a bunch of caveats in this slide. I'll just sort of highlight one, perhaps the most obvious one, and that's that there are some pretty major differences across states in terms of the methods and assumptions that different utilities are using to estimate incremental compliance costs. And so it's just important to keep that in mind. At the end of the day, there is a certain irreducible apples to oranges element in these comparisons, and one just has to be kind of cognizant of that. The next slide, here we present the dollar per megawatt hour incremental cost for the regulated states. These numbers basically represent the average above market cost of renewable generation that was procured to meet each of these states' general RPS obligations. Although it's a somewhat limited sample here, you can see that the costs were generally at or below about $20 per megawatt hour, which is kind of in the same general ballpark as what we saw when looking at the REC pricing for restructured states. One state here that does stand out a bit is Oregon, where you can see that the incremental costs were actually negative, which in other words the RPS resources were estimated to yield a net savings. And in the case of the Oregon utilities, that was based on a comparison to the long-run cost of a natural gas-fired combined cycle plant. At the other end of the spectrum on the chart here is Wisconsin, where you can see the incremental costs were somewhat higher. And in the case of Wisconsin, these costs were estimated based on a comparison to wholesale electricity market prices prevailing at the time. This was for the year 2010. And in that particular year, wholesale prices were rather depressed due to the recession and low load growth. And as a result, the relative cost of the renewable contracts was relatively high. And so that's why the bar shown here for Wisconsin is relatively large. So this is just sort of one illustration for how methodology can matter. The next slide, we now toggle over to the rate impact measure, showing incremental RPS costs in each of these regulated states as a percentage of average retail rates. So looking at the figure on the left, you can see that costs in these states were, in most cases, at or below about 2% of average retail rates, which is sort of similar to what we saw among the restructured states. However, for 3 of the states in the figure on the left, Arizona, Colorado, and New Mexico, the costs were somewhat higher, up around 3%, and that was at least partially attributable to the solar or distributed generation set-asides in those states. And you can see, looking at the figure on the right-hand side, that the costs associated with those solar or DG set-asides represented a pretty sizable share of the total RPS compliance costs in each of these years. One does have to be a little bit careful about interpreting this result, though, and that's because the solar and DG set-aside costs in these states is partially associated with rebate programs or other kinds of upfront cash incentives, and the costs there tend to be somewhat front-loaded. So there's another kind of apples to oranges issue here, but that nonetheless is kind of important when looking at a snapshot of these costs over time. Next slide. You may have noticed that thus far California has been sort of absent from these comparative figures. California is, as is often the case, somewhat unique. In this case, the issue is that RPS cost reports that the California PUC publishes, those reports include estimates of gross RPS procurement costs and then provide 2 alternate estimates of avoided costs. One of those avoided cost estimates is based on something called the market price referent, or MPR, and this is basically a proxy for the all-in price of a combined cycle plant. And then the other avoided cost estimate is based on numbers that the utilities provided the PUC, and those are derived from historical wholesale electricity market prices. So rather than us kind of picking one or the other of these 2 dueling sets of numbers, what we've done here is just to calculate the incremental compliance costs using both of these avoided cost estimates, and that's what's shown in the table. And so you can see using the MPR as the basis for avoided costs, the RPS compliance costs equate to actually a net savings of about 3.6% of average retail rates, whereas using the wholesale electricity market prices instead yields a net cost of roughly 6.5% of retail rates. So if nothing else, I think this is certainly a very clear indication of just how important some of these methodological choices are when thinking about RPS costs. So next slide, I want to kind of wrap up this discussion of historical RPS compliance costs by turning our attention towards the future. And the cost data that we've presented on the preceding slides are, of course, a function of the RPS targets that were in place over that period. But going forward, RPS targets are, of course, scheduled to ramp up, in many cases fairly substantially. And so one might logically wonder what that may mean for the associated costs of these policies. And so in the figure here, we've just sought to provide kind of a visual sense for how those targets will ramp up going forward. The open circles in the figure represent the RPS targets or procurement levels in the most recent historical year. And those correspond to the axis on the y-axis on the right-hand side. And then the closed circles represent the RPS target in the final year of each state's RPS schedule, so typically sort of 2020 to 2025 timeframe. And so you can see, comparing the open and closed circles, we're looking at fairly sizable increases in RPS requirements going forward over the course of the next decade or so in many of these states. On average, across the full set of states, we're looking at about a 3-fold increase in required RPS procurement levels. And so given that ramp up in RPS requirements, one might expect, all else remaining equal, that those increasing targets could put some upward pressure on RPS costs. And so the green bars here show, just for reference, the historical costs in the most recent year. Now, to be sure, there are a whole host of factors beyond just the increasing targets that will also impact future RPS costs. And those other factors can sort of play out in opposing ways in some cases. And so this includes things like, of course, the trajectory of renewable energy technology costs, whether solar and wind costs will continue declining as they have. In addition, future RPS compliance costs are going to depend upon what happens to natural gas prices. It will depend on federal policies related to tax incentives for renewables and of course, environmental regulations for non-renewables, like the new EPA regs that came out last week. And then, last but not least, future RPS compliance costs will also, of course, depend on the implementation of cost containment mechanisms that are built into many of these policies. And so that brings us to the next slide and the last of the cost-related slides. One aspect of these policies that is often neglected in many of the political debates that have been going on recently about the cost of state RPS programs is that most of these policies have built-in off-ramps or cost containment mechanisms that are intended to prevent the costs and the rate impacts from rising to unacceptable levels. And so these cost containment mechanisms, they come in many different shapes and sizes, which I won't get into here. But what we've done is to take those varied mechanisms and we've translated them into the equivalent maximum possible increase in average retail rates at the peak RPS target in each state. So basically sort of a worst case scenario rate impact. And that's what the horizontal red bars in the figure represent. So in looking at those numbers, you can see that for almost all of the states here, the effective cost caps are below 10% of average retail rates. And in most cases, actually less than 5% of retail rates. So those are sort of, the worst case scenario once the targets rise to their ultimate level. We also show in the figure actual historical compliance costs from the most recent year. Those are the green bars, and these are the same data that were actually on the previous slide. And the purpose here is mostly just to give you all some sense for how much headroom exists in each state before it starts bumping up against its cap. And so you can see a few states on the right-hand side with relatively low cost caps where actual compliance costs are beginning to approach the cap. And those are the states where there is perhaps some near-term risk that the cost caps could constrain achievement of the RPS targets. However, by and large, you can see that most states do have a fair degree of headroom before the cost caps become binding. So with that, I am going to hand it off back to Lori to talk about the benefits studies.
Okay, thanks, Galen. Yeah, so we're going to turn to the benefits. I'll just note, so the slide, the benefits overview, I'm going to move to that. So potential societal benefits of RPS policies include a variety of things: reduced air emissions, health benefits, fuel diversity, electricity price stability, energy security, economic development. There's a variety of benefits that can result from these kinds of policies. But not all states have attempted to estimate the benefits, and they haven't attempted to estimate all of these different types of benefits. But we did conduct a literature review to try to determine the studies that were available and developed for estimating the benefits of RPS specifically. Again, we did not look at the broader literature on renewable energy benefits, but really just the studies that have been done for RPS. And I'll present the summary of that here. I'll note that there is significant variation in the methods that were used and the level of analytical rigor that was used as well. So the next slide is a table that compares or just summarizes the studies that we were able to identify. And so you can see there are a number of states here that have done studies that primarily have focused on estimating benefits for reduced emissions and human health effects, economic development impacts, and wholesale market electricity price impacts. And in most cases, these studies were required by the legislature, actually, as you can see here, and we've listed the studies in this table. So now I'm going to turn to the emissions benefits. You know, about a half dozen states have estimated the emissions benefits of their RPS policies, and most of them have used electric sector modeling to try to, you know, do this estimation. There was one state, Maine, that used a more simplified approach, just based on the displaced marginal generator, the emission rate for the generator that was assumed to be on the margin and that was displaced, although that can vary depending on the time of the day. And the valuation was based on the value of the avoided emissions and in some cases human health benefits. So some challenges to comparing this type of benefits to incremental costs or allowance prices could be captured in wholesale electricity prices already, or emissions benefits are often forward-looking in contrast to historical costs. So there's some challenges there. But so the range of estimates, we've in this table here, we've summarized the, and in the report there's more detailed table and more detailed summary of the studies that were reviewed. You know, the benefits were found to range from about $4 to $23 per megawatt hour, and the time frames vary a little bit across some of the studies. Okay, next slide. So a number of states also looked at economic development impacts of RPS. Those include jobs impacts, direct investment from construction and operation of the facilities, tax revenues, indirect and induced spending, and things like that. And there was some variation in methodologies here. A number of states used input-output models to determine these effects. Others used more simplified case studies that just looked at some of the wind farms that were built, for example, and some of the jobs impacts associated with that. And then a couple of states did more detailed economic modeling. You know, one key issue here is whether these studies actually looked at net or gross impacts. So did they look at shifts in jobs that result from the renewable investment, or do they just look at the total number of jobs without any consideration of, you know, did this take away from other jobs in other areas, or just, you know, shift from another region? So these studies, the benefits estimates have ranged from about 22 to, I apologize, this was a mistake, it's $30 per megawatt hour of renewable generation. So next slide. So another common benefit category for states to examine is wholesale market price suppression effects. So this pertains to the fact that renewable energy can depress wholesale electric market prices by displacing the more expensive generators from the dispatch stack. Because renewable generation can bid in, there's zero marginal cost for the renewables because they don't have a fuel cost, so they can bid in and knock off the last generator on the system, so reducing the wholesale market price. So a number of states have looked at this effect, and they've typically done this through dispatch modeling, looking at scenarios with and without the renewable generation. A couple of issues with these types of benefits in comparison with costs and so forth is that the effect can be temporary, and that to some degree these effects could be captured in the incremental cost estimates if they're because they can be relying on the wholesale electric market prices. So I think it's important to note we've presented these numbers in the study. The wholesale market price suppression effect is usually relatively small on a megawatt hour basis, but you know, applies to the whole market. So typically $1 a megawatt hour or less. But we've also converted these numbers to the benefit equivalent to the megawatt hours of renewable generation that cause this effect, and that ranges from $2 to $50 per megawatt hour. So just to summarize the benefits, We did identify a relatively limited number of studies on the benefit side compared to the cost numbers, because many states really have to examine costs for their RPS compliance, because of the statute or other requirements. And it's more difficult to bound the range of estimates because of the variety of methodologies that were used and differences in approach and so forth. And also, I'll note some limitations to comparing these to costs. I've mentioned some of these before, but some of these benefits can be captured in part in the incremental costs, or the time frames may differ. It's also important to note, I think, that states have, as I noted, only assessed a limited number of benefits here. So there can be a wider range of benefits that are available. Okay, and so just to wrap up some conclusions before we take questions. So just to reiterate, the estimated incremental RPS compliance costs are equivalent to less than 2% of retail rates in 17 states. 10 states have costs less than 1% of retail rates. The remaining 8 states have costs equivalent to 2 to 4% of retail rates. And I've noted the reasons why it's somewhat challenging to compare benefits and costs directly because of these differences in methods, time frame, the limited number of benefits analyzed, and because there can be some overlap in the two. So going forward, some future work that could be done, there could be assessments that were done to try to compare these and use similar methodologies and level of rigor that would allow for more direct comparisons. And as we've noted, some states have already attempted to try to standardize cost methodologies, but there could be additional work to expand the standardization across states to enable additional comparison. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up, and we're going to turn to questions. I'll note I'm flying a little blind here because our internet access is down. So Galen has graciously offered to heard the questions. So he's going to help read those off, and then we'll try to get those answered. So please type in your questions into the webinar. And Galen, do you have a bunch of questions teed up?
I do, Lori. There's sort of a handful that have come in already that we can walk through, and then perhaps some others that folks will enter in. So yeah, just you can enter questions in the chat window in the webinar panel. Okay, so let's see. First question. Is there a standard method across the U.S. for calculating avoided cost? Isn't calculation of avoided cost at the discretion of, dependent on the utility, subject to FERC methodology? So I can provide an initial response, and then Lori, feel free to chime in as well. There is, at least as far as the calculation of avoided costs for the purpose of estimating RPS compliance costs, that there is no standard methodology. I think what this question is referring to is the calculation of avoided costs for the purpose of pricing contracts for qualifying facilities under PURPA. And there, to be quite frank, I'm not sort of an expert on how prescriptive the law is there. But as I understand it, there is some amount of discretion left to the state PUC and even how those avoided costs are calculated. And then, as I mentioned, for the purpose of calculating the RPS compliance costs, there's I would say even quite a bit more. When looking at how states estimated avoided costs for their RPS, there were a few instances where states would lean on the same avoided cost methodology that they used for the PURPA contracts, but in general that's not the case. There doesn't seem to be a huge level of consistency between how avoided costs are treated for those two different regulatory purposes. Lori, is there anything you wanted to add to that?
No, I think that was good.
Okay. Let's see. So next question, regarding your California slide number 18, won't any new generation source, renewable or non-renewable, look more expensive when compared to the wholesale electricity price that includes depreciated generation costs? So this question is referring to the fact that the utilities in California, when they estimate the avoided costs associated with their RPS procurement, they estimate those avoided costs based on wholesale spot market prices. And yes, those spot market prices, those reflect the short-run marginal cost of electricity, and often do not fully reflect the avoided capacity costs that a long-run, a long-term fixed-price renewable energy contract might entail, nor does it reflect kind of the hedge value, so to speak, of that long-term renewable contract. So there are, I think, a number of reasons why one might sort of question the validity of using short-term spot market. They noted that basically none of the utilities' existing resources, either renewable or non-renewable, including their hydro and nuclear facilities, would be cost-effective if measured solely on the basis of their comparison to spot market electricity prices. So I think the question here hits on a very important methodological point. Lori, anything you wanted to add there?
Nope, that's good.
Okay, so the next one, Lori, is I'll put it on your plate. So the question is, you have looked at broader societal benefits of RPS/adoption of renewable energy. Did you look at the broader societal cost of adopting renewable energy, e.g., what is the average cost per megawatt hour of the ITC and PTC, and other tax benefits such as MACRS?
No, we did not look at any of that. We looked specifically at the compliance costs for utilities complying with RPS. And so I think we've kind of explained the methodology that we've used here. And again, we did not look at broader, we only looked at benefit studies that were done for RPS, looking at the impacts of the RPS specifically. We did not review broader literature on societal benefits of renewables in general, just to clarify that. Galen, you might want to add to that as well.
No, I think that's good. The only thing I'll just sort of reinforce is that this was not a sort of totally holistic, comprehensive analysis or summary of all the different costs and benefits. I think we were primarily focused on the incremental costs of the utility, and then for a number of reasons wanted to just highlight a few of the broader societal benefits that often don't get counted there. But I think this question is absolutely on the mark, that there are of course broader societal costs as well. So it's important to acknowledge that.
Let me just add one more thing too. I think that we do note that we did not examine all costs of the renewable generation as well. In some cases, there could be integration costs that may not have been captured in the RPS compliance cost numbers. So we do discuss in some detail in the report about those kinds of limitations as well.
Yeah. Yeah, we spend there's a fair amount of real estate in the report devoted to just sort of discussing the various limitations and caveats. We figured you guys probably wouldn't want to just sit on a webinar for 45 minutes listening to all the caveats, so we kind of glossed over some of that stuff, but that there's lots of material on that front within the report itself. So next question, yeah, so this is important. So the question is, will this information be available after the webinar concludes? I was unable to attend the first portion. So yeah, unfortunately we had some technical difficulties, a number of technical difficulties. One is that NREL seemingly lost its internet right before this webinar began. But then another issue that came up is that apparently the webinar service provider cut off attendance at 100 people. So there were a number of folks who were emailing us as the webinar began saying they're unable to attend. Obviously, those of you on the call now were able to attend, so this might not be terribly relevant to you, but be that as it may, we will be making the recording. I think, Lori, that you guys are going to post the recording. So the recording will be available afterwards along with the slides themselves. And yeah, we apologize about that. This was sort of a kind of last-minute little technical glitch.
Yeah, and also, just to be clear, the report is already available publicly online on both the NREL and LBNL websites, and those links are available in the presentation that will be sent around.
Let's see. So here's another benefits-related question. Do you believe the benefits analysis is rigorous enough to be applied towards value of solar studies?
I'm not sure. Well, let me just be clear what we've done here. We have reviewed the benefits that have been estimated at the state level for RPS compliance and summarized those studies. I think that the question is really beyond the scope of this, analysis or paper. And I guess I would emphasize that we've presented benefits assessments that represent a range of methodologies. So I think you'd have to get into specifics about the types of methods that you were talking about and whether those could be relevant. Because, for example, there were a variety of methods used for economic development impacts. Emissions benefits were more consistent because most states did do electric sector modeling, which is, more common, and a bit more rigorous than using the displaced marginal generator approach. So most states did utilize that. So I don't know, Galen, I don't know if you want to offer any comments on that as well. But
I guess I'd just say two things. One is that, at least as far as the benefits analysis goes, we just focused on sort of a subset of the kinds of things that are often considered within a value of solar analysis. And so there's, kind of the whole series of different elements that might conceivably be stacked up for a value of solar tariff, and we've only really looked at a few of those pieces in the stack. The other thing is that, with some of these benefits, they tend to be fairly specific to a particular region, and so I don't think one would want to look at a number that was generated for one region and necessarily assume that it was applicable somewhere else. I think probably the value of the analysis that we've done from the perspective of value of solar studies or tariff development would be to provide sort of a benchmark set of numbers so that at least when, if a number is developed for a particular region, there are some other numbers that we've kind of summarized that hopefully are in a way that make it easy for comparison. And then also I think methodologically, what our paper does is it kind of tries to lay out the different methodological options and issues and some of the advantages and disadvantages of different approaches. So that could be useful kind of at the front end of one of those studies when just kind of trying to think about how to proceed. let's see. Okay, we've got time for a couple more questions here. Here's one. Has your team done a comparative analysis of implemented RPS versus non-implemented carbon tax or cap and trade for purposes of estimating cost effectiveness of the current policies? Well, on my side, on the LBL side, we have not done anything like that. There are some academic studies out there that have compared RPS policies against some of these other policy approaches, carbon emission reduction policy approaches, from sort of a theoretical perspective. I don't know, Lori, I imagine NREL, you guys have probably done some Reeds modeling on this.
Yeah, we actually did a study a couple of years ago that did have scenarios that were RPS scenarios and carbon cap scenarios, and we tried to look at some of the difference in the emissions changes and generation portfolio changes with the Reeds model. Whoever asked that question, if you want to email me directly, lori.bird@nrel.gov, I can respond to that if you want to contact me.
Okay, let's see. Here's a question. So you've assessed incremental costs to the utility. Is there any way to extrapolate from that to the cost to the consumer? And so, yeah, this is a distinction that I kind of made without necessarily explaining why it was an important distinction or why these things were different. You know, in theory, you know, the costs that a utility bears, at least in a kind of cost of service environment, ultimately get passed through to consumers. But you know, in a cost of service environment, there's often a sort of a lag, just given the rate-making process and how those costs get passed through. So that's part of the issue. I guess there's in restructured states, there are a different set of issues that can make it difficult to really equate the utility costs and the consumer costs, even over kind of a long-run average basis. And the two issues there are, one, that, you know, these are competitive retail markets, and so the price that gets paid, the price that gets paid by the customer is ultimately sort of the result of competitive forces. Now, in theory, you know, the costs that the suppliers bear should get passed through to customers if those suppliers are going to stay in business. But it doesn't always happen in a one-for-one basis. I mean, if the supplier may have you know, some market power or may be able to you know, extract profit from the customers, and the addition of renewable portfolio standard costs may not necessarily get passed through to the customer precisely. So that's one issue. And then the other kind of more limited but perhaps more obvious issue is that in some restructured states, as well as in some regulated states, ACP costs and penalty costs are not allowed to be passed through to customers. And so those are costs that the utility bears that are basically prohibited from being passed through to customers. And so obviously in those cases, the cost to the customer is going to be somewhat less than the cost to the utility. At least over the period that we looked at, ACP costs in most states were pretty minor, so that issue would be not very significant. But going forward, obviously, it could become a bigger discrepancy between the utility costs and consumer costs if ACPs are more heavily relied upon. Lori, was there anything you'd like to add there?
No, I think that was good.
Okay, so let's see. Here's a question, kind of just getting right to the bottom line. Given the caveats in the report, what should the takeaway from this report be? Should we quote RPS costs are less than 2%? Okay, so we're researchers, so we like to sort of hem and haw and give lots of caveats and sort of avoid boiling everything down to a soundbite. I guess if there is just sort of a single number that folks are looking for, perhaps the easiest one is is that the average cost over the 2010 to 2012 period across all 3 years and across all of the states that we looked at worked out to about 1% of average retail rates. So if you're looking for just sort of a single number that encapsulates the full set of states and the full set of years that we looked at, that would probably be it. Of course, keeping in mind that that's an average and that, as we saw, there's lots and lots of variability and variation around that average.
Yeah, I guess I would just say that we did try to distill some of the important points in the highlights slide as well. Yeah,
absolutely. Okay, so let's see. We are getting down to the final. I think maybe time for one last question. The Q&A system is not really working for me for some reason, though. Okay, so let's see. Did you investigate the relationship between the term of contracts and the cost, i.e. some utilities procure RECs on a short-term basis as required, while other utilities sign long-term PPAs. The long-term PPAs may have significant long-term energy savings, while the short-term REC purchases do nothing to lock in future energy costs. We didn't really look at this issue, in part because there's, the procurement, the procurement methods really kind of vary state by state, and so often you've got the regulated states where the utilities are relying primarily on long-term PPAs, and in some cases utility-owned facilities, while in the restructured markets, most of the compliance is being achieved through shorter-term REC purchases. There are some states, some restructured states, where we've seen a growing reliance upon long-term REC or even in some case bundled power purchase agreements. But unfortunately, I don't think the data that we have there, it wasn't really sufficient to allow any kind of direct comparison. I guess just within the very limited sample that we looked at, within just the restructured states, there was not any real sort of appreciable difference in those long-term contract costs and the shorter-term REC purchases.
But we did attempt to look at that and had some very specific detailed information on those longer-term contracts, specifically for the New England states. So I think it's important to note that we did incorporate that data.
Yeah.
Did you want to comment on that? Yeah.
So I think we're actually at the top of the hour here, so we should probably sign off. I know I've actually got to hop on another webinar right now. But so let's see, Lori, I'll let you kind of close things out, but before you do that, I just want to thank everybody for attending.
Yeah, thanks so much for all those great questions and for participating in the webinar. And as we mentioned, we will be posting the slides online and the recording of the webinar, so in case you missed any part of it. So thanks again for joining us.